Hello, everybody, and welcome to AI People. Today, we're talking to Julien Roux, who is the CRO at Nebuly, which is a user intelligence tool for Gen AI products. Welcome, Julien.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for having us.
So we always kick things off by asking you to make a few predictions about the AI industry. I know people like making predictions, but I think it's interesting just to talk to leaders from across the industry and get their perspective on where things are going. So the first one is, how do you see humans and AI collaborating with regard to work in 5 years' time and in 15 years' time?
It's a very interesting question, Ben. Thanks for thinking about that, because I think for the first time in history, we're gonna end up in a situation where blue-collar workers are gonna be better off than white-collar workers. I think it's the first time in a very long time. It might be the first time ever. 5 years out, my bet is that humans will still be part of the process. So we're gonna keep using copilots as copilots, as assistants to humans to become more efficient and so on and so forth. 15 years from now, I honestly hope to be somehow retired, because I'm not entirely sure I'll be able to contribute much in a society where copilots are becoming more knowledgeable by the day, more intelligent by the day, and progress is exponential.
So I think it's a good point that you make about the kind of blue collar versus white collar workers. Because it's something I've been thinking about quite a lot recently as well. And I'm wondering, whether we all need to retrain as mechanics or kind of plumbers or something like that. Because obviously, like robotics is quite a lot harder than the kind of AI and software engineering.
Yeah, that's quite interesting you mentioned that, because just like I think on Sunday there was an interview coming out from a big executive in the US is now heading a foundation, and he's working a lot in the defense sector. And the US are building like hundreds, I think, of submarines. And in the process, they need to find 140,000 welders. 140,000, and they cannot find them.
Yeah.
So this specific company kind of ended up talking to the foundation because they wanted to find out if there was a way to basically like leverage the network to get these people. And it turns out like there is a shortage in that specific part of the market, but there is no shortage in white collar jobs. So I think this dynamic is gonna, start playing out in the next few years. And by the way, I think like it's super interesting to see in some parts of the world, it has already played a role. My wife is from Western Australia, and in that part of the world, GDP per capita is very high, and the business is very mining based, resource based. So it's very common for people to come out of university with a kind of degree and make less money than people that went to work in the mines. Every time I travel back, I think like that might be the future for a lot of us, even outside of mining regions, just because of the kind of AI kicking in. Time will see. Time will tell.
So I remember like my nan, who's passed away now, but I remember her telling my dad that you don't want a job where your hands get dirty, and was basically trying to, push him to get a good education and like work in an office. Are we kind of reversing that process now where, we're telling our kids don't study computer science, go and sort of figure out a more practical thing to do?
I I think that's happening. It's gonna take time, because of expectations from parents. I think there is a degree of pride in sending your kids to university and becoming like very knowledgeable about a certain topic, even if that type of knowledge is no longer a competitive advantage, because OpenAI knows like 100 times more, right? So I think it might take a few years to adjust, maybe whole generation. We will see. But it's certainly the case that it's less attractive. Maybe spend like 5-10 years in kind of higher education to get like bachelor degree, a master degree, potentially like a PhD. When then kind of there is an easy alternative available. I was talking with my lawyers today, and they're very scared. They're very scared because they've been spending like 20 years to build up their expertise and coming up with great like contract writing skills and review skills. And they were telling me like 99% of what they do right now is available within ChatGPT, the free version at the fingertip. Of course, the 1% is still like very valuable, especially for big transactions. So don't think the law firms are going to disappear when you're kind of buying something for 10 billions. But for smaller agreements, NDAs, kind of standard rental agreements and whatever not, it's a big question mark. Well, what's going to happen to those law firms that are profiting from people basically not having access to knowledge today? And so if you flip the coin, I mean, it's going to raise a question as to like how many people need to study law in the medium to long term. And I'm not picking on law, of course. The same thing applies to like accounting. The same thing applies to teaching as well. I think that's another interesting area of evolution.
Yeah. And in terms of the kind of AGI question, I've seen lots of kind of predictions on this in the last week or two, and Eric Schmidt talking about it. Like, where do you see us as being on that path? Do you think it's something that's close now, or still a long way away?
It's pretty hard to make an informed guess. Of course, you can have an opinion. I'm happy to share it, but I think very few people in the world really know what's going on in those big research labs, and understand like how far we are from like real AGI as opposed to very intelligent but still somehow limited systems. If I kind of judge based on what I see today, I think it's still quite far away into the future, because as soon as you start interacting with AI systems on complex tasks today, you feel like it's still basically subhuman in terms of performance. I think there is going to be a first step, and it might take another kind of few years where we kind of match human beings, so being like on par with very intelligent human beings. And then maybe in the future we're gonna get super intelligence, as in being more intelligent than a cluster of educated humans. If I had to make a bet, I would think what's gonna happen faster is having super intelligent models in vertical specific applications. So we might have something happening, I don't know, biology, for instance, or medicine or engineering, systems that are way more intelligent than a research scientist, but only in a specific vertical. Whether that same system is capable of extending across disciplines, I think that's a longer shot. Pretty confident we'll get there, but in terms of timeline, I actually think it's not gonna happen tomorrow.
Yeah. Okay. And how do you see AI reshaping the global economy? Do you think it's going to make wealth inequality much worse, or do you see more opportunity for a wider number of people?
Definitely, I think that if we take a step back and look at what happened in the past, call it 100 years, anytime like technology has been coming out, it has contributed to GDP growth significantly, but it has also increased inequalities, in terms of like some people benefit from that technology way more than others. What has happened, I think, since internet came out, I think it's a case in point. If you look at inequality ratios in the US and to a lesser extent in Europe, I think the dynamic is very clear. I think that AI has the potential to benefit humankind as a whole. But for once, and I'm not typically like one to kind of talk about governments, I think that governments have a role to play here in terms of like determining which sectors to wipe out, basically by allowing AI to completely take over, and then at some point to distribute profits again. And I hope it happens, to be honest, because the last time humanity ended up in a situation like that, when governments didn't step in, we had the French Revolution, and the king ended up with his head rolling in the stairs. I think Peter Thiel, the American venture capitalist Peter Thiel, is also pretty vocal about this dynamic. It's quite interesting that I think he said multiple times he'd like to be as far away as possible from the United States by the time this kind of big inequality gap will play out, moving to New Zealand or somewhere kind of quiet.
Very deep and dark and away from everybody. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. That's one strategy for a billionaire, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, for billionaires, exactly. For the middle class, it's an open question.
Yeah. So before we jump into Nebuly, could you just give us a quick introduction to yourself? You've been in and around the startup ecosystem for quite a long time. I'm kind of interested, what drew you to the life of an entrepreneur?
I think the honest answer is my dad has always been a sole trader. He's now like 60 plus, and one of his biggest regrets is never being able to basically scale up his business from a one-man show to a business with like employees and kind of just like a decent size.
Hmm.
So I've always been quite attracted by the idea that you can create something from scratch and then like thanks to what you created, help like employees, help customers, and kind of creating something that is sort of a living animal, so to speak. So that's like, I think a bit of an explanation, but this is, just an hypothesis. I don't really know for sure, like how I ended up being so attracted by the idea of building something because it's freaking hard. And I
Yes.
think there
Yeah.
is a lot of better ways in life to kind of be satisfied. Because my wife, I'm sure she will agree.
Yeah.
But this has been going for some time. I created my first startup just during university the last year. That was an interesting experience because we managed to raise some capital, build a product, sell a product. Didn't work out in the end, but it kind of created like some expectations at some point in my life. I knew I would have to do it again.
Yeah.
So I was
Kind of
very
lit the
happy to
fire.
kind of, yeah, exactly. I was very happy to kind of get in discussion with some high school buddies 3 years ago now in 2022. Um, Ended up creating Nebuly, and so that's how it happened.
Yeah. So do you want to kind of introduce, Nebuly, the problem that you're solving?
Of course. Um, it was very clear to us back in 2021, 2022 that we were seeing exponential improvements in AI technology. Since 2017, when there was the famous paper Attention Loss Unit that came out, we saw a build up in capabilities. And the bet we made back then was that at some point in the next kind of decade, we would have a lot of interactions between human beings and machines/data powered by AI. This was confirmed, of course, with ChatGPT coming out in November 2022. That was a kind of inflection point. And what we quickly realized is the fact that in order for the systems to work well at scale, you need to have some proper analytics in place. And when I mean analytics, I don't necessarily mean understanding what is the accuracy of the model, understanding what is, the recall and whatever not in terms of like model metrics. I mean understanding if the end user, the employee, the customer, the person interacting with the system is having a great experience, whether they are coming back to use it again, and if they have any feedback, what's the feedback? Um, there is a little bit of common sense, but there is also like a lot of history teachings. Because if we look back at what happened in the late 90s, when the .com, emerged as the hot thing, basically, like websites, um, there was a first phase where companies created websites for the sake of saying they had a website and getting like a bit of a push
Hmm.
in visibility, but then they quickly realized there was value in having a website. And when that happened, they started to optimize that website in as many ways as they could. That's when Google Analytics came out. Back in the days, it was not called Google Analytics. It was an obscure startup that was then bought by Google.
Yeah.
But the key point was understanding how people engage with your website, where they click, what they ask about, if they're happy with the experience, and so on and so forth. And building on that, in the next 20 years, I think companies put in place amazing things. If you think about users now being able to retrieve information on a website very quickly. If you think about companies on the other side being able to kind of get marketing information very quickly, it's a win-win in a way. And we think the same type of dynamic is going to play out this time around. It's a different interface. It's no longer a website. It's a chatbot. It's a voice bot. It's a conversational agent of some sort. But the need will emerge again for companies to be able to understand how people engage with that system. As I mentioned, 2 steps. The first one is sort of launching AI for the sort of saying you're doing some AI, and I think we're beyond that phase. I think it was 2023, 2024 to some extent. I think now we got into a stage where companies are talking about return on investment, making AI initiatives work, make it scale in production. And that is exactly why we think Nebuly is well positioned to support them in that kind of scale up initiative.
And obviously, it's quite a complex task, isn't it? Like getting this kind of user intelligence, because we've all had the experience of like thumbs up, thumbs down, or OpenAI, showing you the 2 different possible answers and which do you prefer. How do you go about kind of putting this analytics together?
It's a very complex situation, to be honest, because it used to be the case that you could track somehow user experience just by monitoring clicks, monitoring scrolls, monitoring time on a page. If I click on pricing, I go on another page, and then at some point I drop out very quickly. It's very easy for you to understand as a company. I didn't like what I saw, like the pricing maybe was too high, it was not clear, and so on and so forth. But if the same question is happening inside a chatbot, it is way harder to understand that type of shock took place. That is because, first of all, we're talking about very big numbers, potentially like millions of conversations a year.
Yeah.
And second of all, because human beings are not great at analyzing and structured data. You can test it yourself. Just take a sample of conversations and spend maybe like a couple hours reading. After a couple hours, you can ask yourself, like, what did I learn? Which are the main clusters? What do I remember? Which were the interesting ones? And even if you're pretty structured, you will basically get very basic statistics out of it. So there was a technological problem because we needed to extract insights from those conversations with 2 constraints. The first one, of course, high quality. And the second one is not bugging the user. What I mean by not bugging the user is not relying on surveys, not relying on any intrusive system, which would require the end user to give them some time. Because people don't have time, people don't have any incentive
It's
in clicking
annoying,
on these
right?
buttons. It's annoying.
Yeah. Like I don't like it when OpenAI gives me 2 options, because I'm trying to get something done. Just give me the best one,
Exactly. We've been like asking companies now for a couple of years, and I think participation rates in any explicit feedback initiative are extremely low. You're typically looking at 0.1% to 1% when you're lucky, which is a very, very small number of people basically to work with. But I think that what's super interesting about conversational interfaces is the fact that end users will end up providing you feedback and insights inside the chat. What I mean by that is all of us, we ask an information. I could ask you like, what is Nebuly doing? And the chatbot responds, Nebuly is an AI company, which is technically speaking correct. It's not a wrong answer. But then the user feels like this is, insufficient. And so they're like, yeah, I knew that, but come on, tell me like what they do in practice. How do they help customers? And then the chatbot responds and maybe provides more detail, maybe it doesn't. The fact that the user had to follow up is quite interesting because it's what we call implicit feedback. That's a signal we can use to understand the expectations were different versus what the model provided out of the box. And if you take like a medium-term perspective and you want to make sure end users have the best experience possible, resulting in the best retention possible, your job is not just to give them answers, it's to give them the right answers as quickly as possible, as few prompts as possible, minimizing what we call time to value. So what we develop basically is sort of a super analyst, which is analyzing all of these conversations with the goal of finding out how many times people ended up dissatisfied, but also finding out how many times people ended up getting the right answer on the 5th prompt, on the 4th prompt, and helping companies figure out like what they should have provided as a default response with the 1st prompt faster. That's the beauty of conversational AI, and there's just so much valuable data sitting in those conversations that just waits to be mined. We want to help companies mining it as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and putting AI systems to work.
Because you mentioned before, that there's kind of an emphasis on production readiness in terms of the companies that you're speaking to. Like, why do you think so many AI projects fail to make that leap into production? And where does Nebuly kind of bridge that gap in helping them get to production?
So we typically start working with companies just before they go in production, like the day before, like the week before conceptually, or the week after, when volumes start building up. In terms of like why companies don't go to production, I think it has mostly to do, to be honest, Ben, with like risk propensity. We talk with many companies. When the manager, the person in charge, is aware of the fact it is a probabilistic system, they know it's gonna provide bad answers every now and then. There is a willingness to move into production and then use Nebuly to make sure that you get as least as possible occurrences of bad answers. But every now and then we end up talking with companies that are sort of looking for the holy grail, so to speak, which is zero mistakes.
Yeah.
And I think that zero policy mistake is going to end up in companies having to wait a very long time before going to production. I'm pretty confident at some point they will have to do it because of competitive pressure from their peers, but it might take them years because it's an unrealistic expectations. There is a huge amount of debate right now in the industry, I think, about what is a fair expectation for AI systems. Very often we expect the system to be performing better than human beings before going into production. Well, I think the bar should be set a little bit lower, to be honest. If they are as performing as human beings, but more efficient at it, I think that should be like a reasonable way to think about going or not going into production. I think we've seen it like autonomous vehicles is a great example.
Yeah.
It's having fewer accidents per mile driven than human beings, but at the same time, every time an autonomous vehicle is crashing, it makes the news and
Huge news
stock
story. Yeah.
prices crash and so on and so forth. So there is a bit of like different expectations for like machine-driven systems versus human beings, and I think managers' ability to accept that kind of residual risk plays a huge role in going or not going into production. Of course, then there is all of the technical work to be done, making sure the system is ready, can scale, you have enough quotas on OpenAI, you've been testing like all of the different prompts, you've got data sources connected. All of that stuff is a must-have. But then at some point, someone in the company must be willing to take the risk to go live. And that has a lot to do with risk management.
And in terms of the customers that you're working with, like who is it kind of ML engineering teams, like product teams, or is it kind of management or a big mix? Like where are you kind of positioning yourself?
Yep. The ideal interface for us on day one is the AI product management team. So the team that is in charge with kind of coming up with the use case, working with engineering to build it, deliver it, and then make it successful, basically. AI product managers, head of AIs occasionally, that is the best landing spot. But what tends to happen very, very quickly is that different people end up being in the loop. What I mean by that is that we have then AI engineering teams coming in because they can benefit from the kind of feedback component we collect to work on the next release of the product. And on the other side, we typically have business teams starting to look at the data we collect, either to understand usage and as a result of that kind of return on investment on the initiative, or very interestingly for external use cases, marketing teams coming in to understand what end customers are asking about, what do they care, what makes them tick. So like the kind of AI product management team is the central user, but then the type of data we collect, the insight, as you put it at the beginning, the intelligence, is quickly be made available to like a whole lot of different stakeholders in big companies that will end up using it for different reasons.
And what do you see as kind of the product teams that you're working with? What are the kind of assumptions you feel they're underestimating when they're trying to build these AI solutions?
Underestimating, you're saying? I think I guess the most common mistake we see, and it's not really a mistake. I mean, companies have to start somewhere, but the most common limitation, so to speak, is the fact that they assume that end users will end up engaging that specific copilot in a very vertical way. So with a very well-defined scope, let's assume this is a HR assistant for people to be able to ask questions about holidays and permits and how to do this, how to do that. The data we collect suggests that if the copilot is good at answering those questions, it's just a matter of time before the employee will start asking more general questions. Translate this for me, prepare that email for that. How about finding this information? Whom should I speak with in the company to do this? And so on and so forth. And this is just natural because I think as an end user, if you're having a great time, why not try more? Why not daring more? And so what we think is going to happen in the medium term is we're going to start seeing, and it's already happening in some customers, a unified interface. A unified interface that is going to be available to employees and customers, just one entry point in terms of UI. It could be like a
Okay.
page in Slack, it could be like something on the website, it could be something on Teams. And then there is an AI orchestrator under the surface, which is basically allocating the questions to different AI agents. The
Hmm.
HR agent, the finance agents, the IT support agent, whatever not. But employees expect increasingly so to be able to ask a lot of questions. So I think as a product manager, you got to start thinking how to broaden up the scope of your copilot, even if at the beginning maybe the scope is very narrow and well defined. And that's not easy to do. Not easy to do because as you launch it, you're gonna start being flooded by kind of conversations, potentially like thousands, tens of thousands, and digging through this data to understand like which direction to take your product next, where to expand, that's quite tricky. And that's where I think kind of collecting data real time is basically helping our existing customers and coming up with a strategic roadmap that they can justify to management. Hey, we're doing this because we know users are interested in A, B, C, D. It's not because we dream about it. It's not because we have a vision. Maybe we also have a vision, but it's because users are asking about it. We gotta somehow give it to them. So I think that's kind of where we see things going. And as I said, directionally speaking, I think unified interfaces are gonna become more and more common.
Do you find the companies you're talking to, there's too much of an emphasis on like the latest, greatest model rather than perhaps, just focusing on the models that they've got today and making those work in production?
To some extent, but I think there is always an element of curiosity, and I think it's important people kind of stay up to date. But then if I look at what's really happening on the floor in terms of like production use, um, you know, making changes is not that obvious. People are not upgrading to the latest version of the model the day it happens.
Hmm.
Maybe they're gonna start testing it out in a dev environment and playing around with it a little bit. But moving it to prod is actually like somehow of a milestone. I think the more interesting question here is what model companies are using. And when we got started, I think there was somehow a possibility OpenAI would end up becoming a monopoly, just
Hmm.
like Google did in search. And to some extent, we still have that perception because most consumers are using ChatGPT on a daily basis.
Yep.
But if you look at an enterprise, basically adoption, it's actually quite diversified. There is OpenAI, there is Anthropic, of course, with Claude. There is Meta with Llama, there is Gemini,
Yep.
and some more exotic stuff. And so, like, I guess the main question we're seeing enterprise-wide is how do we avoid vendor lock-in? How do we avoid becoming the only company using only OpenAI, basically, or only using Gemini? And they kind of like to keep it balanced with two, three different suppliers. And so then it becomes a matter of understanding how much to use each of them to optimize both on cost and on kind of accuracy/user experience.
And what's your view on like the push towards like smaller customized models, like versus, the big frontier models? Are you seeing companies using a mix of those, or generally are most companies still, tending to use one of the big models?
I think we're gonna get there because efficiency is super important, unit economics are super important, but I think it's gonna take a little bit longer to be honest, Ben. Right now we're still seeing companies looking for best performances in terms of accuracy, in terms of quality, in terms of capabilities, rather than focusing on unit cost. I think that will change at some point once the system is basically full production with kind of large volumes. Unit economics will start to matter, and so I think we'll start seeing companies thinking about maybe creating smaller versions of the same model using historical data sets. There is a process called model distillation, something like that. But we're not there just yet. Like if I look at our existing customer base, everybody's tracking costs, but there is not one single company that has been willing to sacrifice performance in exchange for a smaller model just yet. They testing it. Like I think when 3 came out from Microsoft, 2.4 billion or whatever it is, there was a lot of interest, a lot of talk, and of course, like Mistral has been doing a great job with small models. But before actually using it in production, I think that it's a pretty steep resistance. That's our experience.
Yeah, fair enough. So just in terms of thinking about the process of building a startup in the AI space, like you mentioned, kind of startup life is like famously hard and a difficult thing to do. Like what's been the biggest challenge that you found, in the last 2, 3 years?
I think the single biggest problem as a founder is surviving expectations in a way. What I mean by that is when I was working my previous job, I was working in London in a hedge fund. I had to do one thing and I had to do it extremely well. And I could focus. I could just worry about that one thing. But as a founder, you no longer have that type of flexibility. Like I don't have the luxury of being able to focus on just one thing. I need to worry about a lot of things and somehow accept compromises on some fronts. You got to pay people at the end of the month, so the company needs to be up and running, customers need to be happy, but you need to be looking for new customers at the same time, and you need to invest in product, and you need to invest in technology, you need to talk with investors. And none of those things can be taken out of the equation. You can kind of change the kind of allocation of time week after week, but it's always somehow part of your activities. And so for me personally, I think the hardest thing is accepting the fact I cannot put 100% of my time on something and be great, be the best in the world at that. I need to make compromises and be like good enough at a lot of different things.
And obviously, you're part of a new wave of European AI companies, but from what I can tell, you've kind of tried to build quite early in the US as well. So, some companies really try and focus on their home market and then grow in the US at a later point. But it looks like you guys are kind of trying to build the two markets in parallel. Have you found that? Has there been, any kind of challenges you didn't see going down that route?
Great question. So I think you're absolutely right in saying that we've basically been in both markets since day one. And I think that stems from the fact that we have some sort of connections with that market. I think I studied in Chicago for my master degree. My co-founder was at MIT in Boston. We both spent quite a bit of time there. And also the fact we know it's the biggest IT software market in the world. It's kind of twice as big as Europe. So it was clear to us that we had to somehow play both markets. In terms of like how we've actually done it is with presence on the ground in both markets since the beginning. I'm in Europe, my co-founder was in New York. We kind of ended up building like a small team in the US. The second important thing is just creating a product which is somehow globally attractive. And what I mean by that is our solution is somehow completely horizontal in terms of geography, in terms of language, in terms of like type of companies. We can work with any language in the world, including European languages, including English, of course. And
Okay.
that's allowed us to basically work out of the box with companies. And it's not just the US, to be honest, it's kind of global. There is a couple customers in South America, um, customers in the US, customers in most European countries, and we like to keep it that way. The biggest challenge is, as a founder, I think time differences. If you're talking with somebody on the West Coast, 9 hours, and
Yeah.
even with AI, there is not much you can do about it. Um, and the second one is resource allocation. There is always like a little bit of a balance. US is a much more expensive market. Everything is basically
Sure.
like more competitive than in Europe. So, kind of allocating the right amount of capital in both markets is something we've been discussing at the company level for some time now.
And in terms of kind of go to market, do you see, more of the kind of bottom up approach, like, developer led, community led, which is popular with a lot of AI companies, or are you seeing, more of the kind of top down enterprise sales approach, or a balance?
We'd love it to be a balance in the medium term. Right now, because of resource constraints, we have not invested much in community building and marketing. To be honest, it's more of like the enterprise motion. We know which companies we'd love to work with. Reach out to those companies, meet them at events, provide them like with useful vertical specific material, and just get started with them. But what we have realized is that on a local basis, like little communities are starting to kind of pop up, basically. Word of mouth is playing a big role. The fact that the solution has been around for 3 years now, those are quite a long time in the context of AI solutions. And so like in the medium term, we'd like to invest in basically local communities of AI product managers, AI specialists that basically help us convey this message that analytics in production is important and gonna make the difference in the long term for AI success or not.
And kind of last question, are there particular industries or kind of use cases that you're seeing, more traction than others?
Definitely. Yeah, I think I'd like to break it down, I think, in two different dimensions in terms of use cases and then in terms of industries. If we look at use cases, in the past 12 months, the most common use case has been employees' efficiency, internal productivity copilots. Every big company on earth is working on those because it makes sense, because the return on investment is clear. And specifically, like within that use case, I think there is a lot of document search, being able to kind of quickly retrieve information without having to ask a colleague, without spending hours looking in a kind of drive and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is kind of customer facing. So there is an increasing amount of companies that is exposing AI solutions, conversational AI solutions to end customers. And it's not just about support. I think that's kind of the obvious element. I think it's really about changing the way end users are engaging with your software product. So to give you an example, working with several companies in the financial services sector that have embedded copilots, assistants in their mobile banking app. So you can just get into the app, you start asking questions, hey, how much money did I have on my account last month? What should I invest in? How comes you're not paying active interest? Am I travel by travel insurance? And so on and so forth. And I think that's a great way to kind of make the data that is sitting inside the app available to end users. So we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming months. In terms of verticals, I think it kind of boils down to kind of two dimensions. The first one is risk management, and the second one is resources availability. So we're seeing a lot of traction in industrial sectors, because they sit on a huge amount of technical documentation, typically have a lot of customers, and it's not a super regulated sector. It's not like healthcare. It's something like where an error could be acceptable.
So
So
they're moving a
industrial
bit
says
faster in terms
exactly.
of getting to production with their
Yeah.
customers. Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
And another one is media companies. So like online publishing, newspapers, they basically surfacing up new ways of interacting with archives of data, all of the kind of articles that were written like in the past 50 years, all of a sudden they're not just available on Google, but they're available through copilots. So that's the second very interesting sector. And the third one, is financial services. despite the fact that there is a little bit of a more lower risk acceptance, those companies are sitting, banks and insurances, on so many data. They have millions of customers and often like hundreds of thousands of employees. And so like the kind of return on investment for a lot of AI initiatives is kind of clear.
Yeah.
And we kind of seen that in use cases, basically.
Yeah. Great stuff. Well, it's been great having you on today, Julien. If people want to get in touch, whereabouts do you spend most of your time? Are you LinkedIn, X, email? What's the best way to reach you?
I spend a huge amount of time on LinkedIn, so feel free to link me up. I think the website is another great place where to make contact with us. Just
Great stuff.
visit the playground, let us know, and we'll be in contact.
Well,
Thank
thanks
you
for
so
your
much for
time.
having us, Ben.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody watching, and stay tuned for the next episode of AI People coming soon.
Thank you.